Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is Lynn and today I'm doing a deep dive into inks. You can see my growing collection of inks here. No one needs all of these inks, so don't worry about all of this. And if you're new to paper crafting, this isn't meant to show you all the things that you need. Certainly not. But just through the years, I've collected a variety of different types of inks, and I want this to be a little bit of a Crafty 101 on inks, what makes them different from one another, why you might reach for one ink over another, or if you're just starting out, which inks you might want to start with, and how to choose just based on the type of crafting or the type of crafter you are. So let me start by saying also that I'm not an expert. This video is not meant to be the be-all end-all of everything that you need to know about inks. It's just what I know about inks that I want to share with you. And if I have misstated anything, or if I am not 100% sure about something, I'll definitely let you know as I go through and show things. But if I do misstate something, do let me know. Do correct me in the comments. If you could do that kindly, that would be wonderful, because I'm always eager to learn myself, and I'm happy to be corrected if I did get something wrong. But that disclaimer being out there, I'll share with you how I like to think about inks. And I like to think about them as having different characteristics that make them discernible one from another. The first characteristic is the easiest of all, and that is the color. You can easily see the color, usually has a name, usually has a photo depiction of the color on the label, and when you're shopping, that's probably the thing that, hits your eyes first, is the color. The second characteristic is, where is that color derived from? What is the source of that color? That can be either a dye, which is a water-soluble kind of a created or manufactured color, or a pigment, which has larger molecules and is actually derived from something in nature, like a mineral that naturally has that coloring to it. So the color is coming either from a dye, which is manufactured, or a pigment, which is, kind of sourced from nature. The next characteristic is, what is that coloring, whether it's dye or pigment, what is that coloring suspended in? What fluid is it suspended in? Because none of these inks are 100% pigment, none of them are 100% dyes. They are all mixed in with some kind of a solution, and that solution can be based in water, oil, or solvent. So the source of the color itself is either water soluble like a dye, or not water soluble like a pigment, because pigments, think about it coming from like some mineral in nature that's been like very, very finely ground. That's like a physical thing from nature. It's not going to dissolve in water. So there's that, but there's also the suspension fluid that those things are mixed in. So your dye-based inks can be in a water-based solution or in an oil-based solution. So you can have dye-based inks that are oil-based. Even though the dye itself is water-soluble, it can be suspended in an oil-based solution, like your Better Press ink and the range are archival ink. These are dye inks that are in oil, and that's why they do say on the packaging that it's waterproof, because even though the dye is dyes are generally water soluble, as you know, the actual color, but because it's suspended in an oil base, that oil base kind of protects it from being dissolved. And so there's that solvent. Other oil-based or pigments can also be found in different bases as well. So some pigments are like Versacolor are water-based. Some pigment inks like your VersaFine are oil-based, and then different still, some pigment-based inks are solvent-based solution. So there's the solution that it is suspended in. That was the third property. The other property that is physically discernible to the eye once you have it is the ink pad itself. So less about the ink, but the physical ink pad that holds the ink is it can either be a foam pad, like a spongy foam pad that's a little bit more squishy, or a more firm felt or linen pad that is a little bit, it's harder and not as much give to it. So that's the pad, essentially the carrier, what's holding the ink. And so that would be the fourth property. The fifth property is, I would consider what I call the finish to the ink. So what effect does it render, once it's dried? So by that I mean there are some inks that have a chalky finish to them, like Distress Oxides, like the Versa Magic. There are some inks that have a pearlescent shine to them, like the Sukaniko Brilliance, and the Delicata ink, also by Sukaniko. So there's that, and then the Brilliance is more pearlescent. These two, you could say, have a more metallic finish to them. So there's that, and then there's your Versamark, which is just like a clear. And there's lots of different brands that have, like Nuvo has a clear what they call clear mark. Basically a watermark effect, so it doesn't have a color, it's totally clear, but if you do stamp it onto, say, like solid color cardstock, it leaves like a watermark of the stamped image. And so I would consider that the finish to it. And so that would be the fifth property. Each of these different characteristics has different implications to its use, and how you might go about using it, or which ink you might grab for when you are working on a project. And so let's start with color is going to be the easiest thing, right? So the actual color, you're going to find a lot more range in color in your dye-based inks, because dyes are manufactured, and so you can have a really broad range of colors, where pigments are derived from like something that actually naturally has that color, and so you're not going to have quite as broad a range of colors in your pigment inks. So that's one thing. If you're looking for, if you're gonna do like a lot of stamping, a lot of ink techniques, and you're looking for like a wide range of colors, you might want to look at inks that are derived from a dye, as opposed to a pigment. And Next characteristic is, your where the color is actually being derived from. I guess those two kind of go hand in hand. So dyes and pigments they work differently. Dyes are generally water soluble. Pigments are not. Dyes will soak into your paper, and they tend to be translucent, so clear, as opposed to pigments, which sit on top of your paper, because pigment particles, the molecules, are actually larger than a dye molecule. So it doesn't actually soak into your paper, it sits on top of your paper. And as a result, the side effect characteristic that you get is that your pigment tends to be more opaque. And what does that mean? That means that when you stamp a pigment ink onto colored cardstock, it will preserve its color because it's just sitting on top of that paper. When you stamp a ink that is dye-based, it's going to soak into your paper, and the paper itself will impact the actual color that results once that ink is dry. So for example, if I stamp this Altenew dye ink onto white color cardstock, it's going to look one way versus if I stamped it onto like a black cardstock, because this ink is translucent, and so whatever I stamp it onto will impart, affect the final color. Even white will affect the final color. So with your dye inks, when you stamp them, they will look one way, like immediately after you stamp it, it'll look maybe a little, it could look a little blotchy or splotchy. But once it has a chance to actually soak into the paper fibers, it's going to spread out and then more evenly dry. But it also the color will change a little bit because the white of the cardstock will actually make the color kind of fade back a little bit. It won't be quite as like saturated and intense as when you initially stamp it down. So you have to kind of know that about these inks, because they may look one way on initially when you put it down, but then when it dries, you'll notice that it'll change over time. Your pigment inks won't. And because the dye inks do soak into your paper, they are going to actually dry faster than your pigment inks, which sit on the surface of your substrate or your cardstock. And the nice thing about a pigment ink is that it, because it sits on the surface, it actually might lend itself better to blending techniques, because you can move it around more easily on the surface of the paper. You can blend two or more colors to create an ombre a little bit more easily, whereas with a dye ink, as soon as you stamp it, it's starting to dye the paper fibers, and it's starting to set right away. Where the pigment-based inks, they take time to dry, so they are slower drying, which means if you brush your fingers across a stamped image, you could smear it. And if you're not looking for that effect, that could be a bad thing for you. If you're looking to blend two colors, that could be a good thing. The fact that you can move it after you've stamped it more easily. And because it takes longer to dry, it actually gives you time to do other effects, like you could put a clear embossing powder over it and do a heat embossing of your stamped image and have that really nice enamel glossy shine or finish to your stamped image. So your pigment inks, your dye inks, they're just by nature of those two aspects alone will impact, how you can work with them. Then there is the solution that the that color is suspended in. So generally speaking, we have your water-based, your oil-based, and your solvent-based solutions. Your dye-based inks can be water-based, and they can also be, these two are actually oil-based. And that's why even though dyes are water-soluble, the dye itself is water-soluble, it's in an oil base. And that's why these are advertised as being waterproof. My speculation, because Pink Fresh is also, I believe, advertised to be waterproof, I didn't see that it was stated to be an oil base dye ink, but I believe these two inks, just because they are advertised as waterproof, I believe they are in a oil base solution. So the dyes are suspended in an oil-based solution, which makes them waterproof. And that way, if you are doing additional techniques on your project that require water, these inks are more likely to kind of stay put and not actually bleed or lift or anything like that. Whereas I believe the Hero Arts core ink, which is, I think, dye-based, the reactive ink, I think, is a pigment reactive, and I think these are also the dye-based inks. I think they're all water-based. And so you might get some different effects with a something that's suspended in a water base that could be pretty cool, or could be unanticipated if you didn't want it to move. So the other ink, actually, let me backtrack a little, because I said there's dye inks and there's pigment inks, but there's actually a third, and that is hybrid inks. So Nuvo has a line of hybrid inks. Gina K Amalgam is a hybrid ink. The Hero Arts bold inks are hybrid as well. And technically, Distress Oxide inks are a hybrid ink as well. Hybrid inks are great, but they are a little bit of a mystery, because all it means is that they have some dye inks and they have some pigment inks to get their color. And if it's hard to know, is it more pigment or is it more dye? And so you might have some ink pads. Oh, Graphic 45 is another hybrid ink. You might have some that are more heavily pigment based and have more of those properties, and you might have some that are more dye based and have more of those properties. So I think a Distress Oxide actually has more pigment because it blends so well, but maybe it needs to have some dyes in order to broaden the actual color range, because the pigments might be a little bit more constrained by what you would find in nature. And so you just never know. But the nice thing about a hybrid ink is that if you don't know what medium you want to use to color in a stamped image, for example, it's nice to have a hybrid ink in your stash to stamp with, so that you can make that decision afterwards. That's why I like them. You don't have to worry about remembering what did I color, what did I stamp with, and what can I color it with, so as not to move those stamped lines. And so, speaking of coloring, the source of the color, whether it's a dye or a pigment, and the solution that color is suspended in will govern what you can color with, and what effects you can create with other media applied to it. Basic rule of thumb is this: two solutions that share the same base are going to interact with each other, commingle, and spread. Two solutions that are opposite in their base are going to essentially ignore each other and stay where you put them. So what does that mean? Dyes, generally speaking, are water soluble. So if you stamp with a dye that is in a water solution, a water base, then go to color it with a watercolor, it's going to move. Those two share the same base of water, and so they're going to interact with each other and affect one another. And that includes like stamping one ink on top of the other. So if you stamp a water-based dye ink on top of another water-based dye ink, the top one is not going to look the same color as if you were to stamp this on white. It's the color below it is going to impact that color on top, because dyes are also a translucent, because they're water soluble, they're translucent. And however, that's not to say that all dye inks work that way, because these dye inks, as I mentioned, are advertised to be waterproof. And what makes them waterproof, I'm speculating in the case of these two bottom ones, but these two top ones I know are oil-based. So they're in a oil-based, and if you take a water-based marker coloring on or around a stamped image that has been stamped in an oil-based, ink, it's not going to react, and so your lines will stay. Alcohol markers, alcohol is a solvent, and it's as well won't react with something that's water-based. So your dye inks, like your Memento, Altenew, those ones that I showed there, your hybrid inks as well, because they have some, the color itself, the dye is water soluble, water-based. Coloring with your alcohol markers should be a-okay. It shouldn't interact with something that's dye-based in a water-based solution. So then we have your pigments, which are, they sit on top of your paper, and pigments are not water soluble. So with these, you actually can watercolor on them, and it should be just fine. Pigments that are, say, like your VersaFine suspended in oil, you can watercolor over that. Oil and water don't mix, so your lines should stay perfectly okay. Your oils, though, will break down with a solvent applied to it. So your solvent or alcohol markers can actually potentially move your oil-based inks. So your VersaFine, these lines could move with your alcohol markers. Hybrid inks are great for, like I mentioned, if you don't know what you're going to color with, you could stamp with that and figure out what you're coloring with later. However, not all hybrid inks are equal. And there's nothing on the packaging that's going to tell you, oh, it's 50% dye, it's 50% pigment, or it's 20-80 or 80-20. You don't know for sure. And so what that means is that you might have different things happen as a result. So for example, Graphic 45 is a hybrid ink, but they do have a black, I think it's classic black ink, and the with alcohol marker coloring, some alcohol markers do just fine. Others, the ones that I find have a lot more of the blending solution, so your lighter colors, your more pastel colors, they can actually move the stamped image. And my speculation is that maybe this has more of a pigment in it than a dye, and that's why it's able to move with enough, enough of the solvent. And if you were learning to do things like color with color pencil and then use a solvent like Gamsol, that could move things that are in an oil base or things that are suspended in a solvent based solution. So the solution that the coloring is suspended in is going to have an impact on, how it reacts to different things, either below it or on top of it. So, for example, with distress oxides, they're formulated, it's a hybrid, it's got pigment and it's got dye based. So you can lift the color with water. So there's, some aspects of it where it's water soluble and the color, you'll get some lifting. There's some aspects of the pigment ink where it sits on the surface nicely. It doesn't dry immediately, so you can move it around and blend it more easily and smoothly. So there's a little bit of best of both worlds with your hybrid inks. Then, as well, things like your solvent-based inks are great for stamping onto non-porous surfaces. So if you are like a mixed media artist or even a card maker who likes to use different substrates like acetate, vellum, things like that, you can stamp onto those with a solvent-based ink, and it'll actually kind of stay as opposed to just wipe off. So your solvent-based inks are good for that. However, solvents do dry faster, so that's one thing to keep in mind. Kind of like your alcohol inks. So the alcohol is a solvent base, and when you color that alcohol ink onto paper, for example, the alcohol does evaporate, and so that's going to be the same with a solvent-based ink. So, for example, with when you buy the StazOn, I don't have it out, but if you buy the StazOn opaque inks, this is the packaging. It actually comes. It's not, the ink pad is actually uninked. And you actually, when you go to use it, you actually have to ink it up yourself for the first time. And part of that is because it is a solvent-based ink, which can dry more quickly over time. And so, that's one thing to kind of keep in mind. The pigment-based inks, because they don't dry immediately, you can have other things like clear embossing powder that you can pour over top, and then it'll grab that powder and you can melt it, so you can do effects like that. So I think that's probably one of the biggest questions is, I like to color with my alcohol markers, what ink should I use? Well, you're looking primarily for something that is dye-based and water-based, and that should be your best choice. Hybrid inks will generally work well also. If you are using a water-based coloring medium, then you want something that is pigment-based and preferably suspended in oil or a solvent so that it doesn't mix. But there are some exceptions. Like I was saying, there are dye inks that are waterproof. So, but that's because they are in an oil solution. So you kind of want to look for those. And then you might want to have some create some different effects like a metallic or a shimmery look. So you might want to look for inks that give you that effect, like your Brilliance inks have that pearlescent shine to them. And so, that might be something that you're looking for. The Versa Magic ink, Dewdrop inks, and your Distress Oxides have a little bit of a chalky finish, so maybe that's the look that you want. Maybe you want to stamp onto black cardstock. Your dye inks won't work on a black cardstock, and they will look different depending on what cardstock or substrate you are stamping onto, because dye inks are translucent where pigment inks are opaque. So, for example, this is the StazOn opaque white stamped onto black, and it looks great. You wouldn't really be able to do that with a dye-based ink, because it would soak into the paper, and that black of the paper is going to impact how that color looks. So generally speaking, if you're looking for inks that kind of, whatever you stamp onto, they're going to look the same, then you're looking for a pigment-based ink. And so, those are some of the reasons why you might reach for one ink versus another. Something like your StazOn inks, you can stamp over, and with your pigment inks, you can stamp over another, another inky background or technique. And because it does sit on the surface with a pigment ink, like I said, it's going to maintain its color. It's not going to be affected by whatever happened below it. But something like your solvent-based inks that are in a solvent solution, suspended in a solvent solution, if you were to now, on top of that, do like a water-based technique, then that should stay, and it shouldn't be affected by like maybe some splatters that you wanted to add that were water-based. So so these are a little bit more kind of fixed if you're gonna apply water techniques after it or before it. So there's that for consideration too, just in terms of the type of crafter you are and the types of techniques that that you're going for. If I was brand new to paper crafting and I didn't have any inks yet, what would I use, or what would I pick up first? VersaFine Onyx Black is a pigment ink that is oil-based, and this is fabulous. This is my favorite ink to stamp with. I probably use it on every tutorial video because I stamp all of my sentiments with this. Always crisp, fine line detail. It has a felt pad, so if you are new to stamping, or you tend to have like a little bit of sort of splotchy, not, sort of fuzzy lines, the felt pad works great across different types of stamps. So even if you have like an acrylic stamp that might be a little squishier, the felt pad is going to kind of reduce, potentially over inking. And this is like the most sort of jet black ink that I own, and so this is my go-to for pretty much all of my sentiments, except for if I want to maybe use a different color for my sentiment, which is kind of rare, but I sometimes do. So I would say this is a really great one to have. I would definitely also recommend a clear ink. Versamark is the one that I like. That's so that you can do your embossing techniques, heat embossing techniques. So I would definitely recommend that. And then I would recommend a hybrid ink. My two favorites are the Gina K Amalgam and the Nuvo Hybrid. I just find that the Nuvo Hybrid it works really well with both water-based and alcohol-based markers. It's just that it's not as dark of a black as the amalgam. So if you really like super dark lines, jet black lines, I think this one I'm tending to now start to prefer. But the Nuvo Hybrid has been my go-to for a really long time. And then I would also, if you use acetate or maybe a vellum or something like that, an archival ink, so either the StazOn or the Ranger Archival ink, which is a dye-based ink that is oil-based. These two I find you can stamp onto things like your clear acetate if that's something that you find yourself needing. So I would say these at a very base, that gets you kind of your sentiments, your stamped images that you color with. And if all you're going to do is kind of stamp and color, maybe that's really all you need. Although if you do have the Better Press system, lots of these inks will work really well with the Better Press. I just did a series on that. But the Better Press ink by Spellbinders, I still have to concede that that is the best ink for your Better Press system. But that's highly, highly specialized. This is a dye-based ink that is oil-based. If you like to do techniques with your colored inks, depending on the techniques that you're looking for, I would recommend Versacolor, because it's a pigment ink. It's slow to dry, so you can clear, heat, emboss it. You can blend with it if you like direct to surface techniques, like, take this and swipe, or use an applicator to take this to the surface of your paper and do some ink blending. I think Versacolor is really great for that. And Distress Oxides would be the next one that I think are really, these two I think are really great for ink blending techniques. So I would go with that. If you do have the Better Press, this works beautifully with the Better Press. I found I got really great results with Versacolor. Pretty good results with the Distress Oxide too. But generally speaking, though, I have found that just stamping like sentiments and images with Distress Oxide, I haven't gotten super great results, but I've gotten decently good results with Versacolor. So if I had to pick between the two, I would pick Versacolor. If you like your techniques where there's layering stamps or layering stencils, where it's one color applied on top of the other, I would actually go with a dye-based ink, just because these take time to dry. So I would go with something like the Altenew inks. I think are really good dye-based. I grab those. I also grab the Nuvo inks pretty often. What I like about the Altenew line, though, is that it's you can get them in these like 3-packs that have like a nice ombre color line. So if you're doing a layered flower or layered stencil that's designed so that there's like shadows and highlights, it is kind of nice to be able to get them in these colorways that have that easy, light, mid, dark. I haven't found that to necessarily be true with Nuvo, but I do like the Nuvos for both your ink stamping techniques and for stamping sentiments. These work great for stamping sentiments too. The Hero Arts line of inks I've started to use more recently, and I like them a lot. They're very juicy, really great color. And I think these would be great too, but these are, there's a bit of some decoding, because there's core inks, there's reactive inks, Hero Hues Core, Hero Hues Reactive, and there's Hero Hues Pigment. Then you have their Bold line, which is their hybrid, and then I think these are their dye-based inks. And so there's there's quite a lot there and I can never remember which one is which, to be honest. So I'm just not as familiar with them, but they're really fabulous. So I think the core inks are a dye-based ink, and I think these are dye-based as well. And then you have your Hero Hues pigment inks. And I think the reactive inks are a pigment ink that are water reactive. So they're probably in a water base. Okay, so for those types of techniques, it's not to say that dyes you can't blend with them. I just don't think, just by the nature of the fact that they're, as soon as you stamp them, they're starting to soak into and like dye the paper fibers. They're setting, that color in the paper, faster than your pigment inks. So that's why if you're doing a lot of blending techniques, I feel like your pigment inks, I have found better success with the pigment inks. But if you're doing a lot of layered stamping, pigment inks move and they can squish around, or you have to like heat set them to make sure they're really dry before you move on to the next layer. And they're just a little bit more cumbersome, but like I said, it's not like it's impossible to do a layered stamping or a layered stenciling. It's just that it's not as convenient. And you may not get the same effect because these are opaque, where your dye-based inks are translucent. So they're gonna, kind of each, consecutively or subsequently kind of soak into the paper fibers and then just meld. And so you'll get a little bit of that nice color range as you're doing your layered stamping or layered stenciling. So that's what I would recommend if you are looking for, Memento inks are a really good dye-based ink too. Oh, that's a toss-up. Yeah, Memento inks, these also stamp really well with sentiments too. So I would definitely look at the color range, to kind of decide which dye-based ink, if you like to do your layered stamping or layered stenciling. But I do like that, Pink Fresh, Altenew, they do sell them in those colorway packs that have a light, a mid, and a dark. And so for that convenience factor, I kind of tip the scale in their favor. But in terms of actual like performance, the Memento inks are fabulous as a dye ink as well. So that's how I would break down, what I would recommend if you were just starting and you didn't know what all inks to go for. Like everything else, I feel like is either kind of specialized and niche, like the Brilliance and like the Delicata. If you're looking for those very special finishes, then they're fabulous for giving you that. But if you are looking just for your like everyday basics, what I grab for most are these ones, these three, for sort of, this one, but the amalgam is slowly replacing my Nuvo hybrid. So, these three I think get me pretty far in my day-to-day inking needs. And the rest are just really fun to have. So the other thing I would say though is maybe look for, if you want to do like a little splattering just to test what you might like or not like, invest in the little ink cubes, because they're smaller, they're easier to store. For the same amount of money, you can get more colors as opposed to like the larger full-size ink pads. It might not always be possible to find something in the small cubes, but if you can, maybe go for that. Same with Memento. These dewdrops are the smaller kind of ink cube equivalent to the larger ink pads. So I would go that route as well, because you can get maybe little 3 or 4 packs just as a bit of a sample to just play with, experiment with, and see what you like. And so that's another way to go. I also got a lot of questions about where I found these trays. I get them on Amazon, and so there's actually they're sold as a 5-pack. There's actually trays that are designed for dewdrop inks as well, which I might pick up. And then there's a storage, like a little storage unit shelf that they all fit into. You can get these trays in like larger, I forget how many you can store, but it's just bigger and it stores more. It has a bigger footprint and it just stores more ink cubes. But I like this one because I can because it does have that storage unit that I can just slip these trays into and have them all on their own little kind of rack. So, a link to that will be in the description box. And what I'll do is, I'm not going to link to obviously every individual color, but what I might do is just link you to the major brands. I'll definitely link to the specific ones that I called out and recommended, like my VersaFine, which is my favorite, and Versamark. But otherwise, I might just link to general categories of inks if you want to learn more about those and shop for those. I hope that this has been a helpful video. If you have always wondered about the different properties and characteristics of inks and what makes them different, why you would choose one over the other. If you have any questions, do leave them in the comments below. If I know the answer, I will definitely share that with you. If I don't know the answer, hopefully somebody else who's watching will read your comment and they can educate both of us. So I welcome everybody to leave your thoughts and opinions. These are just my thoughts and my opinions based on my own experience. So do share your own thoughts on this as well. And if you have any recommendations, leave them in the comments too. I'm always eager to kind of learn other people's takes on things. And so I welcome that. I hope to be doing more of these Crafty 101 videos where I do a deep dive into kind of one aspect of paper crafting, just to kind of explore different nuances. And so I hope that this has been a useful, informative video, and I hope that you'll stay tuned for the next one. Thank you again, and until next time, happy crafting and have a fabulous day. Bye.